Hello again. Today we're looking at chapter 8 on Judaism. And this is a long chapter. There's a lot of text in the book to read, and we don't have very many slides today, but again, the video will probably be a little bit longer, and hopefully this will help you with reading some of that information and some of the points that are contained in the textbook. Okay, as we make our way through the material today, of course the author has another introductory story about a travel that he's made to a different place in the world and trying to learn about another religion. And this time he has arrived in Jerusalem, and he's going to tour many sites and see many things and interesting things to do, but it's quieter once he first gets there because it is the Sabbath, and that is Saturday, and so that is the day of rest, and so that explains why it's so quiet. But he sees the ancient temple ruins that are still there that were destroyed in the year 70. He sees the Dome of the Rock that was built by Muslims where the temple once stood. It is said that Abraham came to this very spot. He mentions there that Salem is actually part of the name of Jerusalem, but it means peace. And there are other words that are similar to that, Shalom and Salam, but they again basically have that peace meaning. But the western wall is part of the remains there, but that's where people go to contemplate and pray, and then women are standing on the right of it, of the western wall, and men on the left. And then little pieces of paper, people will write on them, then roll them up and place them within the cracks of the stones. And these are in essence prayers that people will leave because they've come to speak with God. The author was going to take a picture of this, but he was stopped again because it was feared that he would violate the Sabbath. So even taking a picture was considered work, and so he was not able to do that, at least in the company of these people. All right, so as we move to our first slide with some real content on it, talking a little bit now about Jewish history, and let me back up just a little bit, but it's a long history. It goes back about 2,000 years, and there were two temples. There was one that was built, and then it was destroyed, and then there was a second one built. And so the first slide kind of mentions that near the end about the destruction of the second temple. So that is correct. But after the destruction of the first, there was an attempt to come back from slavery and rebuild the other one. But when they were away from the temples and in slavery, they had to make some changes. The Jewish people did, is who I'm referencing. And now they really can practice their religion anywhere in the world. It used to be the temple was the main focus of Jewish belief, but they had to adapt to some of the changes that were happening in their homeland, and we'll get into some of those too. All right, so as we look a little bit more about the history, the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians somewhere around 586 BCE. Now, today, Babylonia is modern-day Iraq. And the Jewish people, now they spent about 50 years in slavery there. And then while they were in slavery, of course, they couldn't worship at the temple. They were in another land, so they basically had to have a different way to worship. And so this may have been one of the first times in which they had to write down their religion in order for it to survive and pass on down through the years. And that is in essence how the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, was actually created. So the 2,000 years that we're talking about of the history of Judaism shows how we have rabbinical Judaism and traditional Jewish life. And so that has a long history itself too. Now, the Hebrews themselves were a people who did not have a land, and they traced themselves again back a couple thousand years to Abraham. Now, the Hebrew Bible, what it contains is the Israelites' view of their relationship to God in the midst of a lot of historical events that we're going to talk about today. And in the first temple, there was basically the ceremonial part of the religion, and that ended there to pave the way for what I mentioned earlier about rabbinical Jerusalem. And so the Jewish teachers were known as rabbis, and then they often made their comments. One is called the Midrash, but it's their interpretation of the biblical laws and practices. Now, the word Bible comes from the Greek, and the Greek word is biblia, which just means book. So the Bible is really translated as the book. And so the Bible dates back quite a bit. Our textbook, for example, says somewhere around 1000 to 900 BCE, and the final form, really, at least the Hebrew form, was on down to maybe about 200 BCE, but a long period of time. The first 5 books, now we've got that mentioned on a little bit later slide, but that is called the Pentateuch or the Torah. The Pentateuch is a word that basically means the 5, and the Torah is basically something that means the law. So that is the most, I think, the common perception is that Moses wrote those books, but some people don't believe that. Now there's basically 3 divisions to the Hebrew Scriptures. We've mentioned one already, that was the Torah. And then you have the prophets, or the Nevi'im, and then you have the writings, or the Ketuvim. So those other words basically are translated into the English that I mentioned. Now, as a whole, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, all together, they make the Tanakh. So that's an acronym that's made up of the first letters of the Hebrew names for the 3 sections, T, N, and K. Now, there are many accounts that are contained in the Hebrew Bible, so we're certainly familiar with a lot of them, I think, but it might be Adam and Eve, and then we see some of the patriarchs that, again, are going to help further along the Hebrew belief. We see the matriarchs, so women are also featured in the Hebrew Scriptures, Moses and his brother Aaron, and more. So sometimes Torah is used in a wider sense than just the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, but it could refer to the whole complete part that we've already mentioned, those 3 parts together. Now there are also a group of people in the Hebrew Scriptures that are called the prophets, and they speak on God's behalf to the Jewish people. And the prophets, they focus on the history of the Israelite kingdom. There's 2 divisions. They are called the minor prophets, and sometimes people call them the former prophets, and some of the others are called the major prophets or the latter prophets. So the minor and major distinction doesn't mean that one's more important than the other. It's just in reference to the length of the books. Some are shorter or minor, and then some are longer or major. Now the Hebrew Scriptures also have historical books, proverbs, hymns, psalms, and poetry. And there may be a little bit of difference in how the Hebrews order their scriptures in the Bible versus what Christians do today, but all the books are still really incorporated. And so the textbooks also mentions before these were written down, then they were transmitted orally from family to family on down through time. All right, so just a little bit more here. We've already mentioned about the temples, and this first slide really focuses a lot on the second temple, and that was, again, after the first had been destroyed, and then the Israelites were allowed to come home by King Cyrus, and then they built the temple, and that took a little bit of time to do, but that is really in reference to the second temple, and then eventually that one was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, who had come in and were really trying to quash some of the uprisings that had happened from the Jewish people. Okay, but again, these were mentioned that the Hebrews did not have a homeland, and so this is how they come to live in Israel. Now that's still a hot debatable point today, is that people who live in Israel say, well, God gave us this land forever, and we can see a little bit later in the recording today how that has come to be and why some people say, no, that's not what should have happened. Now, the second middle item on the slide here is the first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE by the Babylonians, we mentioned, in modern-day Iraq today. And then when they were in exile, before they were allowed to come back home from King Cyrus, they had to really archive or put down their oral teachings down in a written form in order to survive. So let's focus a little bit more on a little more history, but the book of Genesis, for example, really tells the origin story of the world, and it presents God in a way that he is an intelligent, active, masculine power who overcomes the chaos and brings in something orderly. The creation lasts 6 days, and the seventh day is the Sabbath or the rest day. All that was created was considered good. There are other creation stories out there. For example, the Babylonians have the Enuma Elish, and that is, again, an epic poem that talks about how everything came into being there. Now we see, for example, also the Garden of Eden. We see Adam and Eve, the first man and first woman. Adam's name actually means basically man or mankind, and Eve's name basically means the mother of the living. All right, so with Adam and Eve, we learn more about them, but they're living here in the garden. But Eve's the one that seems to have a little bit more ambition and personality, and Adam it doesn't seem that he has that much characteristic, at least displayed in the Hebrew Scriptures. But it's interesting how Adam and Eve, their story, has influenced the views of men and women in marriage for many thousands of years afterwards. Well, there are children, Cain and Abel. One's a farmer, one's a herder, and we know they, at least Cain didn't at one time get along and murdered his brother. Genesis also tells about the great flood, and of course there are other cultures that have a similar flood story. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh is very similar in nature to what Genesis records in terms of the great flood. So other cultures have, again, stories that are very similar to what appears in the Hebrew Scriptures. Noah, for example, and his 3 sons and their wives, they survived the flood. They give an account of how we have different races of people upon the earth. Later in Genesis, in chapter 11, we see the Tower of Babel, and that explains how we have different languages in the world. They were building a tower, and God confused their tongues so they couldn't understand each other, and when that happened, they stopped building, and then people moved all over the world. We also read in the Hebrew Scriptures of how many people lived to great ages. So Adam lived to 930 years, and the oldest person mentioned is Methuselah, who lived 969. Again, there are other parts of the world in Mesopotamia that have stories that are very similar to all these things that we've been mentioned. Now, when we mention patriarchs, for example, Abraham is the first, and patriarch just means father source. Now, we also have matriarchs, and of course, they're going to be mother sources. Now, Abram, when we first encounter him, his name is Abram, and then later on, his name changes to Abraham, but he is also from Ur. Ur is modern-day Iraq in our time, but he is told to leave his home and go to the land of Canaan. So this is the beginning of the land establishment that the Jews would believe that, hey, God gave us this land forever, and nobody, can alter this arrangement. So God enters in a arrangement or a covenant, an agreement, a contract with Abraham. And so as part of this covenant, God requires Abraham for the male children to be circumcised as a sign of their relationship with God. And so all the things that I've mentioned so far are still in the book of Genesis. And again, one of the most famous accounts is Abraham and how he deals with his son Isaac. This is the son of promise, whom the generations of people that God promised would happen through Abraham. This was the promised son. And so then God requires Abraham to sacrifice his son. And so, again, this is the event that, again, many people may have heard of. But Abraham is willing to do that. And then at the last moment, the angel of the Lord tells Abraham to stop. And so his son is not sacrificed. But this was done on Mount Moriah. And that's believed to be the hill that, many, many hundreds of years later, where Jerusalem will be established by the city of Jerusalem, the holy city, will be established by another person, a Jewish person, later on. There are some memorable women that are mentioned in Genesis here. So Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah. Now they're all mentioned and have some interesting roles to play in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now there are many times where God interacts with people, and these are interesting, friendly encounters, yet sometimes they are fierce and frightening, where people are very afraid and scared that talking and being in God's presence would mean their death. Jacob, one of the descendants of Abraham in Genesis 28, has a vision of God involving angels going up and down on a stairway to heaven. And then later on he has a wrestling match with a mysterious stranger who was either God or God's angel. So when we look at other events in Genesis, we see, for example, the 12 tribes of Israel. There's further development of these promises that God made to Abraham, and it's just taken time to play out. But Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, he was his father's favorite, and his brothers were jealous, but he was sold into slavery into Egypt, and then years later he actually saves his family because the famine had gotten so bad, and they had come to Egypt to buy grain, and yet the brothers didn't recognize their long-departed brother from many years ago. They thought he was dead. All right, so moving on from the book of Genesis to the book of Exodus, but it tells us, for example, as the Israelites were in Egypt in time past, they grew to be a numerous people, and the Egyptians began to see them as a threat. And then the law was that the Hebrew children were to be killed at birth, and so one family disobeyed that, and that baby was Moses. Moses means drawn out. And then he is adopted by an Egyptian princess who finds him in the Nile River. And then as he grows up and has a royal education and lots of fancy things like that, he kills a fellow Egyptian because he is mistreating an Israelite slave, and then he flees because he realizes that his life would be taken from him. And then he marries a woman out of Egypt, and then the significant event in Moses' life was he saw a bush that was burning, but it didn't destroy, and he investigated to find out a little bit more. And now remember, he's living in Egypt, which is a very polytheistic place and has many gods, but he hears a voice who says, "I am that I am," or "I am who I am." And this is the God that is saying to Moses that I want you to be my spokesperson and free my people from the bondage in Egypt. And so the verb that is used in the statement "I am that I am" is Haya. And eventually this becomes the name that this spirit, this God, wants to be known by. Some pronounce it Yahweh, and there's some disagreement about that. And a lot of people think that name is too holy to pronounce, so they will say Lord instead. So from there, Moses eventually, after some time and going through 10 plagues in Egypt, this eventually works out to where the Israelites do leave. They are no longer slaves in Egypt, and they are wandering in the desert to find that land that was promised years and years ago. All right, so a lot of the 10 plagues in Egypt, what happened was they show that the God that Moses had encountered was superior to these gods that were in Egypt that had been in existence for some time. Now, the Egyptian ruler, the Egyptian pharaoh at this time, I think, was Ramses II. During the 10 plagues, and of course the last one was the most severe, that wound up with killing of the firstborn of all the Egyptians, but not for the Israelites. And then they made their escape through the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, and then it was parted and they went through. But this would become a holy day for the Israelites years and years later, called the Passover or Pesach, as it's mentioned in Hebrew, but to recount how they were delivered by the Lord against Pharaoh and his army coming after them to return them back to Egypt and slavery. Now, we've looked at Exodus, but Numbers is also a book in the Torah but it helps to describe the migration, the wandering back to Israel, where they're going to establish themselves as an independent people. So another significant event was Moses receiving the Ten Commandments from God. And again, now our author points out that codes of living were also well in existence at this time, but King Hammurabi was one who had a written code, a code of living, a code of laws. So again, there's lots of other systems out there that are similar to the ones that are described here in the Israelite or Hebrew history that our author also includes in the chapter. Now, again, there was a covenant between God and the Israelites, and it basically says that if you worship me, then I will provide for you. And so that is basically what happens with the Hebrew people, but there's a series of where they will go astray and then basically say they're sorry and come back, and this goes on for quite some time. Now, the book of Leviticus talks about animal sacrifices, for example, about what they should do, so in several chapters there. And then it takes up ritual purity. It talks about which animals can be eaten, for example, to avoid the blood. It has other restrictions about not cutting the beard. And then when they had more religious festivals, which that's one of our last slides, what they were supposed to do there. The book of Numbers talks about the people and their wandering before they were allowed to enter the Promised Land or Canaan. And then this took up to about 40 years, so they had to be reminded of the law, and that's really the purpose of the book of Deuteronomy. It means the second giving of the law. So they had wandered so much that a different generation had risen up that hadn't experienced these things, and so they had to be told about the requirements that they had to God. Now, our book also mentions that there's debate over how much of this has actually occurred or not, but there are no Egyptian records that mention Moses. Now, that was a common name back then. There's no mention of a slave rebellion or an exodus from Egypt, so that's maybe one thing to think about too. There's also no evidence of this wandering of 40 years by the Israelites when they had disobeyed God and they were forced to do that. Now, there is a section that talks about the gods of Egypt, and we mentioned that they were polytheistic, but again, Egypt has their own creation stories, but what's really important in Egypt, of course, is the Nile River, and life depends very much on whether that river has plenty of water or not. It's going to be a good year if it does, and it's going to be a bad year if it does not have a lot of water. So now one of the creation stories involves Nun and the birth of 9 gods, and that's called the Ennead, and that's the Greek word for 9, but there's lots of different gods there: the god of the air, the god of the rain, the sky goddess, the earth god, and on, like some that we have seen before. Now, the Egyptians had some interesting beliefs, but they believed that after death you would appear before a court of gods, and they would really decide whether you had lived a life that was worthy or not, and based upon your good deeds or your bad deeds, it would determine whether you would enter the afterlife and live safely forever or not. So, again, many of their gods had animal characteristics or qualities. So, for example, Anubis, he was the god who led or guided the dead to the courtroom of Osiris, but he had the head of a jackal. So, the gods of Egypt were worshipped at home and at temples. All right, so moving on just a little bit further, now the judges and kings. So, by this time Moses had died out, and then the people who led the nation of Israel now. So we're talking about a substantial number of people, possibly as many as millions. But these judges were not courtroom leaders, but they were really more of military and generals, so to speak. So that's kind of maybe one way to think of them. But Joshua and the judges, really the book of Joshua and Judges, and Joshua was Moses' second in command, But they really talk about the Israelite expansion and division of Canaan. So now they have arrived in their promised land, and what are they doing then? So the first king in Israelite history was Saul, and that was somewhere around 1025 BCE, well before the events here on our slide. And then now after Saul came David. David was the next king. Now he's going to establish the city of Jerusalem. So he takes a hilltop town, and it was Jebus, and that is going to be renamed to Jerusalem, and that's going to be the capital of the nation. So it was very important, to establish a town with high elevation, and that's what happened. Now this has been confirmed by archaeological evidence. Now David's son Solomon follows him, and so the book of Chronicles really talks about that. Solomon is the one who builds the first temple. So before this, when the Israelites were worshiping their God, they had to do it in temporary little settlements. Now Solomon's going to build a permanent home there for God to be worshipped. Now after Solomon dies, one of his sons takes over, and then Israel splits into a northern and southern kingdom. And one of the issues that divided them was about taxes, and that's just kind of an interesting thing there. But eventually what happens is the northern kingdom falls first, and that happens somewhere about 721 BCE, and Assyria, the nation of Assyria, actually conquered them. And then the southern kingdom, or Judah, they were able to have their independence a little bit longer, on down to about 586 BCE. Now there were prophets all during this time, and they were prophesying and giving God's word to the people and trying to tell the people what they were not doing right and how to be pleasing to God as well. That was, taking place. All right, so you can imagine how sad the people were in 586 when they were taken away from their home, and then how much they did miss worshiping. This is, in our book's author's opinion, how the Sabbath came about, the Sabbath type of worship while they were enslaved in synagogues. Synagogue is a word that means lead together. They developed, again, because they were not able to be in the temple. So while they were away from their homeland, Hebrew was used, the language was used less and less, and so Aramaic is kind of a related language, but that became more common. And then there was more talk of an evil spirit called Satan, and going on around this time too. So finally, eventually, Cyrus the Great, he comes to rule in the Persian Empire. And then he's going to allow the Jews to go back home, and one of the first things they do is to rebuild the temple and rededicate it somewhere around 515 BCE. All right, and so let's move on a little bit to the slide. Now, we've talked quite a bit about the Torah and some of the books and the events that happened already in the video, and so this slide just mentions, hey, what makes the first 5 books. There they are. And we mentioned there about the divisions. The Torah was first, the Nevi'im was the second, or the prophets, and the Ketuvim was there, the writings, the many writings that are in the Hebrew Bible. So moving right along. Now there are some major festivals. We're going to get to that in just a second, but just to show you some of the conflict that happened during the Second Temple era. For the Jews, it seems like they have had a rough time in history, but now we are familiar with Alexander the Great, but Israel during Alexander the Great's time was part of his Greek Empire, and then Alexander died somewhere around 323 BCE. His generals then divided up his empire, and one of his generals was Ptolemy, and he got Egypt. And then another general got Syria. His name was Seleucus. And later on, under the Seleucid Empire, Antiochus Epiphanes, he came to rule somewhere around 167 BCE. And he just did not like the Jewish religion. He wanted to establish a religion where Zeus instead was worshipped, and he did a lot of things to antagonize the Jews. So he disgraced the temple. He put pork on the altar. He forbade circumcision. He just did a lot of things to be really mean to the Jewish people. And to the Jew, pork was a scavenger animal that it was forbidden. You could not eat it. So they, what was done to the temple just really disgraced it in many, many ways. At any rate, a group of people, of Jewish people, decided to stage a revolt, and that was the Maccabean or Hasmonean revolt. And it was these 5 brothers who banded together, and they were successful. So they took back the rule of their country, and then they rededicated the temple to Israel's one God. Now, one of the festivals there I'll mention now is Hanukkah. It was a winter festival, but it remembers the rededication of the Second Temple. So Israel had about 100 years of freedom, and then the Roman general Pompey came in and took control again of Israel around 63 BCE. And so Israel, they have had a problem with, because they were being ruled, they were being exposed to Greek culture. That was Hellenism, and again, think of Alexander, who was spreading that around the world. Hella means Greece, so really they were, putting their way of living around the world. But that's always kind of been one of the factors that, was at play in Israel. Some other groups that were active during this time were the Pharisees, and this was a group that was really strict. They were really conservative. They wanted to preserve the Hebrew way of life and careful observation of their laws. Now, rabbinical Judaism kind of develops and then continues the work of the Pharisees. That's one group. Another group were the Zealots, and they were really patriots. They were just really unhappy that foreigners had come in and trying to rule Israel. And zealot comes from the Greek word for zeal. That's probably could tell that. But the Romans would refer to the zealots as robbers. And the zealots were not above using violent means to get what they wanted. The Essenes was another group, and not a whole lot is really known about them, but there seemed to be several thousand, and they just didn't live in the city. They just thought things had deteriorated so much that they wanted to be away from others, and they lived out in the desert near the Dead Sea, but they did not believe in animal sacrifice. They didn't want to eat meat. They avoided wine, but they were skilled in medicine, and they studied the scriptures and just wanted to be apart from society. They thought, for example, there would be a time when God would end the world and bring in a new, better order. They thought of themselves as the sons of light, and they were fighting against the forces of darkness. Now, a final group was the Sadducees, and they were people who were members of the priestly families that were living in Jerusalem, and they were probably taking charge of the temple and its activities, and they probably were even kind of a more traditional group in their behavior. But all these groups were kind of active during the time frame that we're talking about. There's also been a discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were discovered in the late 40s and early 50s, and they were found at a place near Qumran, and that's kind of near the Dead Sea on the northwestern shore. But what they found in the caves were all kinds of copies of the Hebrew Scriptures. They were very old copies. And so 2 kids were playing, I think, soccer. One of them kicked their ball, went into the cave. He went in there to retrieve the ball and then saw this collection there, or stumbled across the collection of what was to become the Dead Sea Scrolls. All right, so now rabbinical Judaism, we've been talking about that. It really came about now close to the 1st century, very close to that, about 6 BCE. And then the Romans were in charge at that time. But the Israelites just wanted to have self-rule, and they wanted all these other foreigners to leave them alone. Now, it seems to be the case that the Israelites would have a minor victory, and then they would suffer kind of a crushing defeat at the hands of their occupiers. Okay, so moving on just a little bit further here, but there are some interesting developments when it comes to the history and how the canon of the Hebrew Scripture has come about. So there was a decision to figure out if the Hebrew canon was really what contained God's Word. So they basically had a meeting and they tried to figure out which books would be included and which ones would not. Now, during this time, there were always kind of some revolts, and the Roman government would come in and put it down. So one of those happened in 132 in the Common Era, and then 3 years later in 135, and this resulted in a lot of deaths of people who were causing up the trouble. So this kind of gives you an idea of what's happening, that the Jewish religion is really kind of leading to a lot of troubled events that these governments are having to put down. Okay, but the Midrash is an interpretive work that explains the Hebrew Scriptures. So what you have is a lot of Jewish people who are studying the rabbis, and then they will come out with the Scriptures, and then they'll try to explain it, their commentary about what's going on. Another one of these attempts was called the Mishnah. The Mishnah means repetition. The Midrash means seeking out. But again, it was these commentaries written by the rabbis. The Gemara was a third one. The Gemara means supplement, and it actually resulted in what we call the Talmud, which means study. So it's very hard to become very proficient in these studies. I haven't spent much time with it, but it just takes a lot of studying there to really become really good in knowing what this is. So usually the scriptures would be in the middle page, and then the writing around it would be the commentary that would be given by these people. All right, so just a few other things I want to mention before I pick up with the festivals there, but they mention Moses Maimonides, and he lived around 1135 to 1204, but he wrote some very good books that made him famous, and they really defended Judaism. He said it was a rational religion, and the faith that they had was based upon reason. They were complementary one to another, their faith and reasons for their faith. And then he also is important because he helps really to define a Jewish creed, some of their beliefs that really characterize their faith. The Kabbalah is a book. It means received or handed down, but it's the whole body of Jewish mystical literature. So there are lots of passages that it comments on in the Bible that have caused people a lot of speculation. For example, there's a couple individuals, Enoch and Elijah. They did not die. Well, how were they transported to God? And that's explained a little bit. What is God's throne like? That is another question that this Kabbalah would try to answer and handle. All right, but there are some other books there that I've given you kind of an idea of what some of these actually include. All right, now as we move on just a little bit before our own, we also know in history about what happened to the Jewish people with Adolf Hitler. So again, there's been a lot of things, ancient and modern, about what happens with the Jewish people overall. And so there's a little bit in our chapter that talks about that. I'm not going to go into that because I think everybody pretty much kind of knows what's happened there. It also mentions some of the ancient things that happened that affect Jewish people were the Crusades. Sometimes they were mistaken as Muslims, and they were killed as a result of that. The Black Death in the Middle Ages, for example, was something that affected Jewish people. I know others as well. And then just retaliation from other groups of people. So I mentioned that because our book does too. Now, it is interesting how Israel did get a modern state, a modern nation now that is still in existence. But the author points out that the Holocaust kind of helped bring this about. So the Jews were persecuted as a people. They don't have a homeland anymore. And so Zionism, you may have heard that, but that's a movement where, hey, the Jewish people should have a permanent home. And so this was wrote about in a book by Theodore Herzl. And then after that, over a period of years, there were some steps that came together. The Balfour Declaration came next, and that happened somewhere around the time of World War I. But basically, it was a statement by the British government saying they thought that the Jewish people should have a homeland. And then slightly after that, the British made a mandate of Palestine saying, well, hey, this is going to be the new home for Israel. And then many years later, after World War II, the United Nations actually voted to divide this British mandate of Palestine into two states, one for Israel and one for the Arabs and Palestinians. So Israel liked it, but the other groups did not. All right, so again, that's an interesting way that has come about. And typically the United States throws its support behind Israel. Now, for the Jewish belief, there is no official creed, but they do have central beliefs. That's one God. It's belief in the words of the prophets, so what they spoke is true, that God did give the law to Moses, that there will be a Messiah or Savior who will come one day, and then that there will be a resurrection of the good and the bad in the world to come. Alright, so a lot of their practices, their religious practices, to really make it short, the Ten Commandments are at the heart of Jewish morality. Orthopraxy is correct practice. Orthodoxy is correct belief. So Judaism is more interested in correct practice of their beliefs than the beliefs themselves. We mentioned the Sabbath in our introduction, but that's a special day of religious focus and dedication, and that's why you really don't work. There are some strict observations when it comes to what it can be done and what cannot be done. So, hey, not taking photographs was in the part of the opening chapter. Not operating light switches or driving cars. It can be really strict, but this is supposed to be a joyous day for Jewish people. Now the Romans, when they learned of this, and going back quite a bit of time, they thought the Jews were just lazy for not working one day out of 7. They would never think of observing that type of thing. Alright, so now to our major festivals and holy days of Judaism. We've got several listed here. They all have significance. They all have lots of use of symbols. And these are important days for Jewish people who are devout and want to practice their faith. Rosh Hashanah is listed here first, and then kind of when it is celebrated. But it is celebrated at the end of harvest season when all debts can be paid off. And this is again in the autumn, somewhere late September, early October. Now, the New Year period of 10 days, that's called the High Holy Days. Now, it ends with Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur actually means the Day of Covering. The Day of Atonement is very similar in meaning, but it's a very solemn day of the year. It's a day of fasting, prayer, and reflection. And it's supposed to cleanse people for the new religious year that lies ahead. The Sukkot, or shelters or booths, sometimes comes after the High Holy Days, but it recalls the wandering of the early Hebrews after they had left Egypt. So in the past, what happened was the Israelites used outdoor temporary shelters that were set up in the fields to help protect their crops at harvest time. And so today, what happens is that families remember that, and they still construct these booths, and sometimes eat and sleep in them, but remembering of what their ancestors did. We mentioned about Hanukkah already, but rededication of the Second Temple. It's a winter festival. It's also called the Feast of Lights, but it recalls the time when the Second Temple was rededicated and oil lamps had burned miraculously for 8 days. Now, some people will also use a menorah when they're remembering this, but families will use it on 8 evenings, and then children are also given small presents too. And the mother's role is important during this time. So we've mentioned there are some other festivals there that we want to mention. One we'll pick up with is Purim. Purim means lots on the PowerPoint. and it recalls God's protection given to the Jews in the time of Esther and Mordecai. So basically the Israelite people were facing extermination by the law, but yet because of Esther's request to the king there, that the Israelites were saved. Now, what families will do is they will read the book of Esther, and then they celebrate with food and sometimes giving money. We have seen the Passover or Pesach, which means Passover. It recalls the Hebrews' departure there from Egypt, and it's a feast with freedom, of celebrating freedom, and they do that with prayers and a special meal that's called the Seder. The Seder means order. So they would use food such as bread without yeast, or matzo, wine, parsley, hard-boiled eggs that symbolize new life, and salt water, which symbolizes years. And sometimes if they have meat, it'll have an animal bone in it, and that represents the lamb. All right, and then they enjoy a meal together and then sing songs of their liberation. So lots of festivals and holidays to consider. Now, in terms of the Jewish dietary practices, there are laws that they are supposed to observe. And Judaism places a great deal of value on cleanliness and care regarding food. So you probably have noticed kosher, but that means ritually correct and applies to food preparation and consumption. So the Jews, for their meat, all blood must be drained before an animal is cooked and eaten. And that is because blood is sacred to God. They, in their temple services, and back in Leviticus, only the priest could eat meat without blood, and anybody who shared in the meal. Animals that died in the field or killed by larger animals could not be consumed. Now, all of these come from their Hebrew scriptures. There's very precise methods when you talk about kosher when it comes to the slaughter, inspection, and preservation of the food. The Jews would not eat pork, mentioned that, or shellfish. They're forbidden, again, from Leviticus chapter 11. And actually, there's an ancient story, but it mentions during much latter or more recent times, still a long way from us, about King Herod. And he did eat pork, and our book picks up on this, not about Herod, but about the bacteria that is in pork that can affect humans and cause them to have terrible, terrible illnesses. And that's what happened to King Herod, is he caught one, and he was basically eaten by worms on the inside. So that's a terrible way to die. But unless you cook it at high temperatures, you cannot kill this parasite that's in pork. So that maybe shows the practical side of some of these laws, is they did have a good intention for people. So the Jews also would believe that you don't mix meat and dairy products at the same time. And so many Jewish households, they will have two sets of cooking utensils and implements, so that one for the meat and one for the dairy. One interesting verse there forbids the cooking of a baby goat or lamb in its mother's milk. So maybe this is about not being unnecessarily cruel, and so people fulfill that too. Now, there are some other practices that I want to mention real quick before we get to this last slide in the different branches of Judaism. But this is some of the things that are worn when you are worshiping. But the phylactery or tefillin is basically something that is used by male, but it's a little small box that contains scriptural messages. So you can attach them to the forehead, and the other is attached to the upper left arm using straps, and it comes kind of down the arm and hand. But again, it's based on a passage that says God's law is in the mind and heart of the person at prayer, and so that's what this helps to fulfill. There is also a prayer shawl that is worn by the male that covers his head and body during the morning prayer, and it signifies humility in the sight of God. A skull cap or yarmulke is used to express reverence before God during their waking hours, and the mezuzah is placed on the doorpost or the entrance of a home But again, it's just a small container that holds scriptural words. So a lot of Jews will touch it reverently, and it's even used by people who really are not devout as well. Now, some Jewish practices include giving a son a name 8 days after birth when he's circumcised, but that recalls God's covenant with the people. But circumcision it also has a good health benefit to it. It prevents infection in hot climates and also some cancer that could develop later on. There are ceremonies for males when they come of age. Those are the bar mitzvah. There are ceremonies for girls when they come of age, and those are their bat mitzvah. So those are interesting. The Jewish faith has really put or sees marriage as a very important part of life, and having children also is an important part of life. Now, finally, the last slide talks about some of the different branches of Judaism. So again, we see a split. So there are some different things that are emphasized by different groups, and the Orthodox Judaism is really traditional Judaism. So until these other branches came along, there was actually no need to call it Orthodox because it was the only type of Judaism in existence. So this, remember, Orthodox means the right belief. Okay, so that's one. Now there are some different characteristics for Orthodox Jews. One of their beliefs is that to have a worship service, you need to have at least 10 males or a quorum. That's called a quorum to actually take place. They have more traditional gender roles where men are the breadwinners and women are really leading the household. It's interesting about the beard hair in front of the ears is sometimes left uncut by the males. That goes back to Leviticus where they believe that. Women wear a kerchief on their head because a woman's hair is considered seductive to men, so it's covered up. And again, they may definitely follow the Sabbath and a kosher diet. So about 10% of the population is basically Orthodox. The next branch is called Conservative Judaism, and basically goes back to Europe in Germany. So they accept change, but they do it carefully. They don't want to lose their Jewish heritage, but they are accepting of some change. But in the U.S., about half of all practicing Jews are considered conservative. Reform Judaism is where you're going to have religious tolerance and then combine civil culture with Judaism. So Moses Mendelssohn is the one credited with this form of Judaism, and he basically just says is that, hey, if you're Jewish, embrace your faith, but also you're going to incorporate modern culture. So some of the things they did differently in the Reform Synagogue, men and women sit together rather than separately. Services are conducted in Hebrew and a native language wherever you are. They have incorporated choirs and organ music. And then women may also become rabbis, and girls can have the bat mitzvah that celebrates their rite of passage into womanhood. Finally, our Reconstructionist Judaism is the newest and smallest branch of Judaism. It's by Mordecai Kaplan, who was even later than Moses Mendelssohn. But he was a Lithuanian who came to the U.S., and he was really impressed with the American way of life and the ideals of democracy and practicality. And he wanted Jews to become familiar with as many elements of their traditional faith as possible, but then have some freedom in how they interpreted those beliefs. So it really sees Judaism as something that should change with the culture and with the times. It kind of never stands still, but it evolves with the times. All right, so we have mentioned as a final word or two about the green environment. And here in the Hebrew Scriptures, there are certainly many stories that would emphasize the need for taking care of the environment. You know, Adam, Eve, Noah, they can be some of the first defenders of the plant and animal species. God confirmed that everything created was good. There are other passages that speak positively of the earth and the environment. A passage in Deuteronomy says that fruit trees should not be destroyed even in wartime. And the modern nation of Israel is trying to protect the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, which have been drained for agriculture. So, and the last thing today is, what does it mean to be a Jew? And that there's some difficulty in identifying that. Now, the old standard used to be if your mother was Jewish, then you were too. But now, that does not address the matter of practice. So, if somebody practices the Jewish faith, should they be considered a Jew? That's really the question that our textbook picks up on. Okay, so I think that's maybe some things to help you with the reading and cut down a little bit. It was a longer chapter, and that's why I went into a little bit more detail and didn't cover everything, but tried to give you a good synopsis. And if I can help you with something, of course, let me know. And I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you the next time.